with organizing several conferences on education. There's a long list, and it will take a lot of time, but I'm very happy that she's here. And she has herself organized some of the staff development programs at Delhi University. For example, she was convener of a UGC ASC refresher course in education at Center for Professional Development in Higher Education, University of Delhi, which was organized about 10 years ago in March 2013. And she was a convener of international conference as well on educational policy shifts in neoliberal times, core concerns and critical issues, organized to commemorate 20 years of establishment of Department of Elementary Education at Gargi College, which was held on September 16, 17, 2017. She is a member of several international and national level committees. And just to mention a few, she was a member of the external expert on critical reference group for the project, which was undertaken by a group of 5 institutions, including University of Sussex, Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar University, and then National Institute of Educational Planning Administration, and Jamia Millia Islamia. And she is also she's also a member of several other committees, like member of University Grants Commission Accreditation Committee to promote junior research fellow to senior research fellow, School of Education Studies at Ambedkar University. She's a member of Departmental Research Committee, Department of Faculty of Education, University of Delhi. She's also a member of Committee of Courses, Department of Education, University of Delhi from 2007 to 2009. So she has a very rich experience, as you can say, all around education. And currently she's engaged herself in the education sector and one of the prestigious colleges of Delhi University, Pedagogical College. So ma'am, we have a pleasure in inviting you, and never mind the traffic delayed our session by a few minutes, but we will be happy to cover. And if there are certain questions at the end, we will have time for interaction as well after your presentation. And we have otherwise scheduled tea at 3 p.m. But I'm sure we'll have 3 p.m. No, we'll delay it. No, we'll delay tea by 3:15. We'll not break at 3:15, and we will have enough time for listening to Madam Jyoti Rana's talk. And you may feel free and comfortable before you start. And over to you, ma'am. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation. Over to you.
First of all, I want to start by thanking Professor Bansal for that rich introduction, which was really unnecessary, because we are all scholars. We are all scholars of our own field, and we all do research and we all do publication. But thank you anyway for both the introduction and this invitation. I am very delighted that an institution of agriculture education is making a foray into the field of pedagogy, which is a subject on which I have spent my whole life. So for me, pedagogy and pedagogues and the study of pedagogy, it is like the call of my life. And usually you find students or scholars in the areas of humanities talking about pedagogy, and it is looked at as something which is, more of relevance to the social sciences and humanities. But I want to congratulate this institute for this training program on pedagogy capacity building of agricultural educators. This phrase itself is so promising that it shows light to the world that those who are in the field of agricultural sciences, their pedagogical capacity and building it is important. So the keyword in your training program is pedagogical competence. And 2 associated keywords are teaching skill and teaching methodology. And the key concept, of course, is pedagogy. As we all understand, pedagogy refers, I would like to stand actually.
Sure, please.
So, pedagogy, the literal meaning, the literal word pedagogy translates to a science of teaching. Though in the field of education, it is regarded as both a science and an art, because it is argued that pedagogy is a scientific area of study also, and a social science area of study also, and a humanities area of study also. And it is not just something which is like a science, it is much more than that. It involves elements like reflexivity, like thinking uniquely, etc. And in those ways, it is different from being a mere science. So pedagogy, it's regarded as a science, it's regarded as an art, it is regarded as a theoretical field of study. It's a full-fledged theoretical field of study, and master's, doctorate level courses are conducted in pedagogy. But it's not only a theoretical field of study, it is also regarded as a field of practice. Like, I'll give you a small personal example. My teacher, Professor Shyam Menon, he was also the founder, vice chancellor of Ambedkar University. He would get very upset if you would say pedagogy is only theoretical. He would say it's a professional practice, because when you teach, you learn the practice of pedagogy. So, of course, it's an academic discipline, a very rich academic discipline, and it's the keyword for us in this training program. Pedagogy, pedagogical competence, pedagogic skills, pedagogic methodologies. But there is one more term, one more word, one more concept, which is far more foundational. And I would say the basis on which all methods, skills, competencies of pedagogy rest, and that is the concept of learning. You know, we were a master's student and we used to have this textbook, Psychology of Learning for Pedagogy. It was like a classic textbook of the field. And the title itself, our teacher always used to tell us that keep reflecting on the title, because the title teaches you that all theories of pedagogy, all pedagogical skills, competencies, methods will rest on an understanding of learning. So anyone who's concerned with knowledge production, who's concerned with research, like all of you, you're all scholars in the area of agricultural sciences, the way I'm a scholar in the field of learning and pedagogy. Anyone who's concerned with knowledge production must understand learning, the concept of learning. The concept of learning is at the heart of pedagogy and assessment, and therefore its various aspects, the various ways in which it has been studied, they are important. So with this, I begin my presentation for today, which is titled, as you can see, Learning Theories. And each learning theory has a pedagogical implication and some practices.
Right, so next over.
Yeah. So to start with, the field of knowledge that studied learning is psychology. And psychology is a modern discipline which originated only in the late 19th century. And prior to the existence of psychology as a discipline of study, as a form of understanding, all the topics that were studied in psychology, like human functioning, human psychological functioning, human mental functioning, etc., they were studied by philosophy. And in the late 19th century, some of the great continental philosophers, they performed certain experiments, and then they put forth this case that psychology has to separate itself from philosophy. And the key premise was that the concern of psychology is largely learning. So the study of concept of learning, the need for a study of concept of learning, the need to understand learning in a specialized way as an aspect of human psychological functioning, this was the basis for the separation of psychology from philosophy. And psychology in its early stages as a young discipline, as a modern young discipline of the late 19th century that has continued to develop till today, but it originated at that time. It concerned itself mainly with two areas of human existence. One was learning, and the other, of course, was personality theory. We are not talking about personality theory today, but the concept of learning was a central concern of psychologists. One of the intellectual trends, one of the reasons why psychologists wanted to be separated from philosophers was that they wanted to be less and less like philosophy and more like science. And so the early psychologists, the great American psychologist Thorndike, the Russian psychologist Pavlov, the American psychologist Skinner, they all developed the first modern theories of learning. The early modern theories of learning, theories that offered an explanation of how humans learn. But the method that they used to develop their theory, they did not want to follow the method of philosophy, which was speculation, induction, doing reasoning, etc., etc. They wanted to follow the method of science. So the early learning theories were developed in laboratories with animal experimentation. In fact, as young students of learning theory, we used to always talk with our fellow students because Thorndike experimented with rats, Pavlov with dogs, and Skinner with pigeons. So our notebook always had these boxes. This is the rat box, this is the dog area, this is the pigeon area. So what I'm trying to say is I'm trying to give you an overview of the concept of learning and the different theoretical perspectives there. The first perspective in the study of learning was the perspective by early psychologists who called themselves behavioral psychologists. And they wanted to be like scientists. And they wanted to study learning theory like scientists. And their theories had names which were self-explanatory. Thorndike called his theory learning by trial and error, because he did various animal experiments with rats, and he found that simply by doing things again and again by trial and error, the rats learned. Some of you may have, some familiarity with their method of experimentation. The experiment was the rat had to find his food in a cage. So he would open the cage, let the rat in, and let the rat find the food. And when he learned how to find his food, that is how the scientists, the psychologists generalized that this is how learning takes place. And he found that the rats learned simply by trial and error. Pavlov took a slightly different approach. He developed his own theory by experimenting with dogs, by attaching the giving of food to certain external stimuli and responses, and his theory was termed as classical conditioning. Likewise, there were these theories of learning which were developed by the scientific method and measurement. How much do you learn? In how much time did the animal learn? How strong was the learning? In how much time did the animal forget what was learned? So, using the scientific method and with objectivity, the early learning theory developed, and these views of learning were called the behavioral views of learning, and they did not pay any attention to mental processes. In fact, the term mind, mental, internal mental activity, these terms did not exist in the early learning theories, because these learning theories were focusing on objectivity, measurement, etc. But of course, learning theory has a very rich history in the last 2 centuries. And there are many, many different views, opposing views, etc. My goal in sharing this with you was only to introduce you to how the concept of learning came first in the study of psychology, and how psychology itself developed as a modern discipline of study because of the emphasis on the study of the concept of learning, because psychologists were curious to understand how learning takes place. Now, these theories, these are some of the common features of, say, about 50 behavioral theories of learning, because once this stream of psychology developed, this was the main work of psychologists. The dissertations, the PhDs, the books, the scholarship, the research was mainly around the behavioral theories of learning. Some of the common features of these theories were that learning was defined by measuring what was learned as an external observable behavior, and learning was looked at as a stimulus-response bond. Some stimulus comes from the environment, the animal learns, and then that's SR bond, that stimulus response bond, that's associative bond, that itself was defined as learning. Of course, there are some very visible flaws in this kind of an approach. First of all, generalizations have been made about how humans learn based on animal experimentation. Secondly, human learning is far more complex than the kind of simple tasks that have been given to the animals who were the subject of study. But please remember that this is the early days of psychology as a branch of study also, and as a field that is studying a complex phenomena like learning. So now, implications of the behavioral approaches. If we, let us say, we generalize human learning, how undergraduate students learn. Let us believe in the behavioral theories for 1 minute, that learning takes place either by trial and error, or by classical conditioning, or by bond formation, or by association. Association means teacher gives a stimulus, the student has a response, the response is the answer. A bond is made between the two, and this bond is learning. For a moment, let us believe in behavioral theories of learning. So in the behavioral approach, learning is a teacher-centric additive process. Means if there is a content and it has to be taught to students, then the content can be looked at as reducible. Means its learning is going to be linear additive. And therefore, you break your teaching content into smaller units or smaller lessons. And then you formulate, as a teacher, you formulate a teaching objective for each step. Take a piece of content, take a teaching unit, and then break it down into smaller units. And for each small unit, each small lesson, have a teaching objective. This selection of the content can be based on the student's previous knowledge. And then this content, concept or skill can be presented to your students through a direct instruction, and the observable behavior, which is the learning outcome, for each teaching objective is to be specifically outlined. Now, therefore, assessment, how will you do assessment? If you believe that learning takes place in this way, and then you believe that instruction should be accordingly organized in terms of teaching objectives, and each teaching objective and whatever you teach will have a learning outcome, then assessment will be based on awarding marks, and the assumption will be that the students wrote memorize. The students wrote memorize because you have a teaching objective, then you have a learning outcome, and then you wrote memorize, and therefore all of this leads to a rote memorization based examination oriented system. If we go back for a moment to that last slide, it looks like very natural. It looks like what our education system is. This is what we do in our undergraduate education system. We formulate a syllabus, we formulate a teaching objective, and now the UGC's draft national curriculum has actually given teaching objectives for all courses at all levels at the undergraduate level. And not only now the UGC undergraduate course curriculum has given these teaching objectives, it is also asking universities and institutions to specify the learning outcomes that are expected from each of these teaching objectives and each of these syllabuses. So education or teaching learning is looked at as the acquisition of a predefined body of knowledge. This predefined body of knowledge is defined by the area of study, and the approach to teaching it, the approach to pedagogy, the approach to assessment is information oriented. And since it is information oriented, since it is learning outcome oriented, rote memorization comes at the heart of it. And we have an examination oriented system. So the grip of behaviorism on educational systems is so robust and so strong that at school education level, our systems are completely examination oriented. And at the undergraduate level, also in the higher education system, the system is largely behavioristic. Now, in the 1960s, there was a spate of very influential publications by some psychologists in different parts of the world, which challenged the behavioral views completely. They rejected the behavioral theories of knowledge, behavioral theories about learning on the grounds that the ideas have been framed based on animal experimentation. And therefore, they cannot be generalized to human learning. Human learning is very complex. And the assumption that behaviorism was making was that if there is a stimulus given by the teacher in the classroom, the student responds to it. And educators said that this is a very passive view about human nature. And therefore, new views emerged that emphasized the internal mental processes. And these views were termed as cognitive views. From the word cognition. Cognition means that if there is anything in the outer environment, my mind has the capacity to make a representation of it. So the cognitive views, again, these are not one theories, these are 10, 20, 30 theories. And the field of learning, the understanding of learning continues to remain divided between behavioral theories, which believe in external observable variates, and cognitive theories, which believe in internal mental processing of information. So these theories looked at the mind as an information processing system. And here the emphasis was that during teaching, some information is presented to the student. It is stored by the student in the memory. Here, memory was a keyword. In behavioral approaches, bond formation, association, readiness, learning by associating two things together, that was the keyword. Here, memory is the keyword. And cognitive views explained learning by a process of mental functioning, internal mental functioning, that students work on the information that is provided by the teacher, and by virtue of their memory, they enable the learning processes of encoding that information, storing that information, and at the time of assessment, this information is retrieved from memory. So the cognitive model of learning is based on the assumption that the human mind is an information processing system. During teaching, whatever information is presented to the learner stores it in the memory. There are various psychological devices that enable that. There is remembering that takes place. And this information is organized systematically through various processes like encoding, storing, and assessment involves retrieval of this information. The pedagogical goal in cognitive views. So as a teacher, you can be a behaviorally oriented teacher who believes in writing teaching objectives, looking at the learning outcomes, and assessing students based on that, which is very immediate, which is very examination oriented, and our higher education systems are largely oriented towards that. But you can also be a cognitively oriented teacher who does not necessarily believe in breaking down your teaching content completely into teaching objectives and writing down the learning outcomes associated with it. And you can have the approach that what you are teaching is going in the long-term memory of the student. And the cognitive theories here, memory is the keyword. Memory, remembering, forgetting. pedagogy and assessment is organized around these terms. So the cognitive psychologists have distinguished between working memory and long-term memory. And they say long-term memory is a permanent store of knowledge. And the goal of pedagogy is to teach in a way that the information that the teacher is presenting in the classroom gets organized in this permanent store of long-term memory. And the cognitive psychologists believe that we can say that learning has taken place when information goes to this long-term memory. And they give some examples of it. Like, for example, they say if you're a student of mathematics and you learn certain formulas, you never forget those formulas. They become part of your knowledge. Why? Because they go in your long-term memory. So the pedagogical implications of cognitively oriented pedagogy is, first of all, cognitivism is different from behaviorism in the sense that it doesn't think that the student is a passive being. It thinks that the student is also an active being. Why? Because the student has a mind. The student has capacity for mental processes, which behaviorism completely ignores. Because behaviorism is all about teaching objective, teacher teaches, student learns, learning outcomes measure what the teacher has taught, and assessment accordingly follows. But the cognitive theories endow the learner, the student, with inherent capacity to learn. And because there is this inherent capacity to make active sense of your environment, and the students are capable of internal mental activity, and that is how information is processed, assessment practices are based on memory of concepts and ideas from a more long-term perspective in comparison to behaviorism. Yes.
Trial and error is not a mental activity.
No, trial and error is not a mental activity at all. In fact, your question itself reflects the basic fundamental difference between behaviorism and cognitivism. Trial and error, there is no mental in trial and error. There is no mind in trial and error. There is no internal mental activity in trial and error, because in trial and error, the food is kept in the rat box. The rat is like a passive being who has no mental capacity, no mind, no capacity to process the information. It is only behavior. Behavior means external behavior. And it is a bond between where the food is kept and what the consequences follow for the rat. So the rat finds out that when I go this way, I get the food. So he learns that. But he doesn't learn it in a cognitive way. He doesn't learn it by conditioning. He learns it by trial and error. And by the way, learning by trial and error is not just the first modern theory of learning. It is also a very influential theory of learning. So it is a behavioral theory. It's not cognitivist at all. And in another very important thing you see in trial and error learning is, in behaviorism, there is a term called extinction. So in behaviorism, they say that if some behavior is not repeated, or if it is not reinforced, so if learning is not continuously practiced, or if it is not continuously reinforced, it becomes extinct. So extinction is an important concept in behaviorism, and so is reinforcement. That is why a lot of value is attached to rewards and punishment. And this whole concept of rewards, punishments, awards, etc., it's coming from behaviorism only. So behaviorism doesn't have memory in itself. Memory is not a term in behaviorism. But cognitivism believes that there is memory, and not only it argues that there is memory, it also argues that there is long-term memory. And it also gives you a goal of pedagogy, which is to send information in the long-term memory. And further, cognitivism offers much more. It offers a perspective on forgetting also. It says that when information is presented to the students during teaching, that information should be integrated with their own network of long-term memory. Every student has a conceptual structure in their mind, a conceptual structure of long-term memory. Say, for example, I'm teaching learning theory to a student. The student will have a conceptual structure, and the new theory that I teach, I have to present the information about that theory to the students in such a way that they can organize their new material of study according to their existing structures, conceptual networks within their own long-term memory. So for the cognitively oriented teachers, the long-term memory, the structures of long-term memory, the networks that exist in long-term memory, they are important basis for planning their teaching. When you teach, when you present information to the students, if you are a cognitively oriented teacher, you will try to present it in a way that the student can organize it with reference to his existing corpus of long-term memory. Not only that, in cognitivism, they say if you give the right cue, the memory networks get activated and organization can happen. Cognitivism also offers a perspective on how remembering and forgetting occurs. They say that if something has been in the long-term memory for a sufficient amount of time, and actually there have been experimental studies in this regard also, then the mind will not forget it. Or if you forget, it will be slow in forgetting it. And I've given one example that a lot of cognitivism-related research studies have taken place in language. That when you learn a new language, how long do you remember it and how do you forget it? And they say that if you practice it, if you learn a language and you practice it for a certain number of years, then, you'll remember it for 25 years or so on. So these are just some perspectives using which you can plan your teaching. And this is the third perspective, which is in a way a combination of behaviorism and cognitivism. And students of learning theory, they do a course and they do many readings and then they come to an understanding of behaviorism and cognitivism in learning. But just within 1 hour span, why I am introducing a somewhat third perspective is because policy now is more and more based on constructivism. Constructivism is the idea that all learners, all students have an inherent tendency to understand whatever is going on around them. And therefore, the word constructivism, the connotation is that students learn best by making constructions of their own. Where are these constructions made? These constructions are made in mental schemas. Mental schemas are like the units or building blocks of your learning. Now, this is a vocabulary which is different from the vocabulary I have spoken while introducing behaviorism or cognitivism, but there are some similarities also. So in many ways, it is sometimes argued that constructivism believes in an active learner, that as a teacher, when you are before the learner is also active. The learner has capacity to make sense of the world. And best learning will take place when you put the learner at the center of the learning process. And how teachers can do that? Teachers can do that by connecting what they are teaching to what students already know. And since the policies now, the National Education Policy 2020 and the some of the new policy documents that keep on coming from Niti Aayog also, they are all based on constructivism. I do not know how far the policy makers understand this term, because constructivism, I've spent 10 years of my life studying constructivism, because constructivism is studied in learning theory also. Constructivism is studied in pedagogical theory also. It's studied in sociology also. It's studied in literary theory also. But it's like a fashionable word on which policy is made. I'm sorry to use that term. And I'll give you one example of the current National Education Policy 2020, the 66-page text. The policy is all of 66 pages. It was released on 29 July 2020. And since it's become such an important piece in our country, most of the ministers and people in important positions are talking about its implementation, and Delhi and our university particularly has been at the forefront of its implementation. Some of the terms from this policy, it says new pedagogy. I don't know if the drafters of the policy are pedagogues, means whether they are scholars of pedagogy or not, but जब उन्होंने new pedagogy बोला तो उनका मतलब constructivism की तरफ था. And that's the reason I had to have one slide on constructivism also in today's program. Because pedagogy is a field in which you have a 6-day training workshop, you have a 60-day training workshop, you spend 6 years of your life studying pedagogy and you learn little by little. My goal today was to introduce you to the main perspectives in learning theory, behaviorism and cognitivism, which are very different from each other, which make contrasting assumptions about how learning takes place, and also tell you that there is a new emergent perspective, constructivism, which is very popular with educators. It is believed to be the most important explanation of how learning takes place. तो जब हम new pedagogy बोल रहे हैं NEP 2020 में, तो हमारा मतलब constructivism से है. And it uses this word learner-centered. But you tell me, in an examination-oriented system, are we going to be behaviorally oriented, the first theory, or can we be learner-centered? We have teacher-centric systems. We have syllabuses. We have big syllabuses. So a very important training that is given to teachers, even in higher education, is that clarify your learning objectives. It's the term that I used when we were discussing behaviorism. Write down the learning outcomes that come from those teaching objectives. So you tell me, how can we be learner-centered? We can be learner-centered if we don't have examination orientation. Then, new pedagogy policy also says, सारे terms मैंने policy से ही लिए हैं. You should be experiential. We have a higher education system which is academic, which is based on academic learning. Academic learning means we have syllabuses. UGC is always giving us very nice documents and very nice frameworks around which we can make our syllabuses. But where is the scope for experience in it? Of course, there are practicals, but practicals are also conducted in the very academic way of doing things. Similarly, it says learning should be holistic. You tell us in the last 1 hour what is holistic. It's only verbal learning because our academic systems are like that. My goal is not to criticize the government. These are terms from policy, not only in our own country, but governments of all countries are using this kind of language. We should be inquiry driven. Of course, any field of study goes forward with inquiry only. But in the classroom, when you have formal systems, where is the scope for inquiry? Then we talk about integration. I am a social scientist, you all are scientists. I study very different type of books. I use very different types of research methods. If I talk about my research methods, they will seem very awkward to you. I don't have any knowledge of the very advanced scientific methods that you probably use. So where is the scope for integration? But what the policy is trying to say when they use this word is that the problems of the real world will be solved only when knowledge is integrated. But the thing is that this new pedagogy, which is being proposed in national education policy, while as scholars we try to be like it, our assessment practice, our examination orientation does not align with this. But nevertheless, the policy is alerting us to new developments in pedagogy, new approaches to understand learning. And pedagogy, in NEP 2020 में ये भी लिखा है that there should be advances in pedagogical skills and strategies based on a deeper understanding of learning theories. Learning theory is a full-fledged area of study. I feel what I have presented to you today in 15-20 minutes, actually you need 2-3 hours and you need to have several readings, but you all are scholars on your own field. And you know how much time you will have to read all that. I mean, all I'm trying to say is that these are very ambitious, lofty ideals, that the teachers understand different kinds of pedagogies and they understand advancements and so on. और भी बहुत सी चीजें हैं NEP 2020 में. I mean, these are big ideals. We must aspire for them. But our assessment remains individualized, testing, rote memory-based system. And therefore, the behavioral approach to learning, in which content is presented to students by direct instruction, teachers write down their teaching objectives, they determine the learning outcomes based on that. That is the system which has held its sway in our higher education system. And policy में लिखने के लिए जरूर कहा है, जैसे for example, policy says rote memorization should be done away with. But policy doesn't say that the examination system will be done away with. Policy केवल इतना कहती है कि we will make it less stressful by introducing more exams. Students have an opportunity to give 2 exams. My goal is not to criticize the government or blame it. We are just trying to understand the educational systems and processes of our country, because these are very complex. Their solutions are not so simple. If you and I were also sitting on the drafting committee, तो हम लोग भी शायद ऐसा ही कुछ लिखते. But what I'm trying to say is that when we say pedagogical competence, when we say pedagogical understanding, teaching skill, we have to understand first of all learning theory. Learning theory has behaviorism, cognitivism, constructivism, which is like a mishmash of the two. But our practical assessment systems are based on individual testing. And individual testing aligns with teaching by defining learning objectives and writing down the learning outcomes that you expect from your students. And the same learning outcome, you make a test item and give it in the exam. And UGC itself gives you very good curriculum frameworks where these syllabuses and teaching objectives are broadly defined, not too much in detail, but broadly they define. And then they encourage universities to develop their own capacity and write down their own learning outcomes. Just say, the course that I teach, I have 4 courses. I got this assignment from UGC that write down the learning outcomes. कि ये 4 courses के आपके क्या learning outcomes होंगे. तो वो learning outcomes जब लिख के भेजे हमने, तो we got it back saying, please write it completely in behavioral terms. Because हमें गोल-मोल बात नहीं चाहिए. We want it exact, that what will the student be able to do after you have taught this. So while we are talking about a new pedagogy, तो वो न्यू पेडागोजी क्या है ये भी हमें थोड़ी समझनी है. जरूरी नहीं है कि न्यू पेडागोजी कुछ प्री डिफाइंड हो. इट इज एनीथिंग दैट वर्क्स इन अ गिवन सिचुएशन, एनीथिंग दैट सॉल्व्स द रिसर्च challenges confronting us as scholars. So one part is this. There is just one more thing that I wanted to share with you, which is the preparation of instructional objectives. Because if you are all going to be in undergraduate teaching, then writing instructional objectives is going to be one of the tasks you have to do. And in this, again, behaviorism offers us a system. पहली बात तो behaviorism ये कहता है कि अगर मैं एक कोर्स पढ़ा रही हूँ, Pedagogy of Agricultural Sciences, means in class 10, there is a chapter on agricultural practices. I have to prepare teachers in a pedagogy that is appropriate to the teaching of that teaching unit. Then I have to have a general aim, which will be like my overall aim, and specific aims for the 5 or 6 teaching contents of that lesson. Then beyond that, behaviorism offers us one of the taxonomies of educational objectives. It says that when you teach, say, this chapter, then you have 3 domains: the cognitive domain, which is the mental; the affective domain, which is the emotional outcomes or how you feel after you study something; and then the psychomotor domain, which is the actual skill development. So it says that there are 5 levels at which you write your teaching objectives. The first level is knowledge. Knowledge means just simple recall. You know something. Then there is comprehension, which involves meaning making. And then there is application, which is how you apply that knowledge to real world problems and situations. Then there is analysis, which involves investigation, and of course synthesis, which is the level of discovery, invention, and doing research. So my original plan was that I will divide the group into smaller groups and ask you to come up with one teaching content from undergraduate education and write down teaching objectives on this, but I don't think we have time for it today.
We'll discuss that if we have time. If we have time, we will be able to find some time for it. If we have time today.
I have time.
After tea.
Yes.
Wonderful. We'll decide that. We'll inform you. Sure. Done?
Yes. Thank you very much for being such a patient listener.
Well, thank you so much, ma'am. Actually speaking, you made it so motivating speaking, actually speaking. and so much relevant. In a short time of about 40 minutes, excellent job you have done, actually speaking, to keeping them all together. And this is what we were trying to actually speaking, learn from an educator like you. What are those important aspects? So these are the words which we wanted to learn in the particular course like this. In fact, it's also learning for all of us, those who are organizing this training course. And it is, you have done a fantastic, kind of information you have given to all of us. It's very, very important. And I think, friends, what we have now, actually speaking, why Madam has agreed to stay back even after tea. And we have already decided to have 5 groups, Madam. There are about 48, 50 of them. So we'll have 9 to 10 in each group, and we have 5 groups. They've named them as well. And most likely, one more lecture, which was supposed to be at 4 o'clock after tea, may not be actually speaking taking place because of certain reasons. And, so maybe we can use that time while we'll make groups and we'll have the benefit of Madam's presence as well. And I think this is so very useful, not only that you teach a class or students, then how do you assess them and kind of the policy you talked about it. I will also not say it's a criticism, but this is an excellent analysis you have done of the new educational policy. This is the excellent analysis that I've come across, really speaking. While your existing system is one, what you're talking of is different. So you have a mismatch already there. So maybe in the long term, quite possible, people like you, they point it out, there'll be, kind of a problem solving there itself. Maybe over time, we will try to, change our system of assessment, moving away from this yearly examination or more examination in a year, etc. Could be based on more learner oriented, as you mentioned. So I think, friends, I'm sure you'll agree with me. And if you have any quick questions right now, we can open the floor. But I would suggest that we come back after tea and we will have an interactive section of 10-15 minutes. And we will use another half an hour of yours. But if you have time, then we will be able to learn more through practicals. And that's what exactly we want more. So with this, let's thank first. The former dean, director of IRI, and the coordinator of this program. And
I must congratulate you for this program.
Thank you so much.
Because in our colleges, the science people consider themselves a little bit superior to us. So when computers come for the college and they are to be given, the science people get the very sophisticated maths. We get ordinary notebooks. And we go to our principal and we say, ma'am, why this discrimination? She says, oh, aap logon ne kya karna hai? Unko to bade software bahut kuch chahiye hota hai. Aapke liye kya chahiye? So, I'm so delighted because pedagogy is my area of work. And at this stage in my life, I enjoy working in my area. I have a long body of scholarship और लिखने पढ़ने में अब इतना मजा आता है जितना लाइफ में पहले कभी नहीं आया. I feel so happy when I see pedagogy being propagated. And in our college we have a very famous botany department. It's a very rich botany department. Dr. Shashi Tyagi bhi hamare yahan se hain. Professor Aprajita Mohanty, she's a well-known immunologist. And botany wale to kehte hain, nahi aap kya kaam karte hain? Hum to botanists hain. Hum to botanists hain. And large lands have been given away. Botany garden, botany research plot. And we say pedagogy ki hame to aata hai, padhna padhana sab aata hai. But the respect that there is another discipline. The great British philosopher Richard Kemp, he said there are different forms of understanding. Every form of understanding has its concepts, its conceptual structures. And the third thing it has is a validation procedure. Science has a certain validation procedure. We humanities have a different validation procedure, which is probably not inferior, but in society it is considered a little inferior. At colleges mein ye cheez bahut zyada dekhne mein milti hai.
But anyway, whether we are all teachers,
Yes.
actually speaking, and teachers are supreme. We know about it very well. And this is not only the first time that we are requesting you to come and give a talk like this to a session on this kind. We will have more sessions, more batches organized. And I will request you right today to be kindly available for the subsequent batches as well, which we'll be organizing over time. And we will, of course, inform you and take the time from you whenever you're available to give a lecture like this, and more orientation towards practical also that time. Because we're also trying to learn. I'm present here today, but maybe in the next 2-3 days, Dr. Rashmi Agarwal will be there to take notes of our own. Really speaking, that whether this kind of information of the system was good enough or we should go more practical. As you very rightly covered, just in half an hour, 40 minutes, something about it, and then we go to practical. I think that will be more useful You know, and pedagogy is important. I must tell you this. I mean, this is what my experience is as well, as much as I've learned, you know, being a teacher for 27 years at IRI. So I think this is very important. Friends, so now I think it's important that we come back and learn more from our practical experience as well.